Good evening. I'm Cameo George, Executive Producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Tonight, we're pleased to present an extended preview and discussion of our film, The Cancer Detectives, which premieres next Tuesday, March 26th at 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central on PBS stations nationwide. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Carlisle Companies. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the GBH Voices and Equity Fund, members of the Better Angel Society, including the Fullerton Family Charitable Fund, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the American Experience Trust, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. The story of how the life-saving cervical cancer test became an ordinary part of women's lives is as unusual and remarkable as the coalition of people who ultimately made it possible. A Greek immigrant, Dr. George Papanikolaou, his intrepid wife, Mary, Japanese-born artist Hashime Murayama, and Dr. Helen Dickens, an African-American OBGYN in Philadelphia, plus an entirely new class of female scientists known as cytoscreeners. Once the test proved effective, the campaign to make pap smears available to millions of women required nothing short of total national mobilization. The Cancer Detectives is the untold story of the first ever war on cancer and the people who fought tirelessly to save women from what was once one of their leading causes of death. It is my privilege to introduce our panelists for this conversation. Gene Tempest is the writer and director of The Cancer Detectives. She is an award-winning filmmaker and historian whose work has appeared in the Boston Globe and the New York Times. Her recent credits for American Experience include Citizenhurst and The Sun Queen, and from 2016 to 2017, she served as our series' first ever historian in residence. Deirdre Cooper Owens is an award-winning historian and popular public speaker. She is an associate professor of history at the University of Connecticut and the author of Medical Bondage: Race, Gender, and the Origins of American Gynecology. And Rachel Gross is an award-winning science journalist and the author of Vagina Obscura: An Anatomical Voyage. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Atlantic, National Geographic, Wired, NPR, and more. And now for our discussion. Gene, I'm going to start with you. Can you share with our audience some of your first reactions to the details of this story? And tell us a little bit about, as the research commenced, what intrigued you about the lives and work of people like the Papanikolaous, Murayama, and Helen Dickens?
I think it's a great question, and one of the things that was really exciting to us, really from the first, was that this film had the opportunity to be really a true group portrait about these four people who easily could have been a film or a whole body of work, on their own. And so I think that was going to be both really an opportunity and also a potential pitfall. So, we worked really hard to figure out how do we weave all these stories together. And I think as it started to come together, it became really clear to us that it was going to be the power of the film, because it's the whole point, and we hear one of the commentators say it on screen here, but that this really is a life-saving test that we have thanks to an enormous coalition of people. And that's something that we found more and more powerful as we looked more and more closely. I mean, we're always just, one dead boss away or one world war away from not having, something as crucial and as vital as the pap smear in our lives. And just how many things had to come together, I think was something that really was interesting to us from the first. And then, once these people start to come alive, I haven't seen the film in a couple of weeks, and just hearing Dr. Dickens again, hearing her voice, there's these moments where you realize, okay, these are people, and seeing that kind of spark of life, seeing artist Ashime Moriyama on screen for the first time there with his wife, and seeing these people be real, having that kind of spark of life moment of recognition, behind the medical advancement that maybe we take for granted today, I think is always something that's worth drawing out. These were people, and these were people in many cases who fought very, very hard and for decades to make this something that can save lives.
And so, Gene, you talk about how seeing these three characters, really four characters, because Mary Papanikolaou, George's wife, is also an important, critical character in this film. But as I'm listening to you and you're talking about the people and how just they inspired so much delight and conversation and curiosity, I'm also reflecting back to about a year ago when we started this project. We were all very confident in the story of the people, but we were very nervous about the word and how to talk about it. Can you talk a little bit about, just share some of how we thought about telling this story? We knew the story was important. We were committed to doing it, but there was a little bit of like nerves or almost squeamishness about the word. So I'm going to start with you, but then I'd also love to bring in Rachel on that point as well.
I was going to say, I'm going to pass the mic pretty quickly because we've got some really eloquent experts in the virtual room. But I think obviously there's not a family who hasn't been affected by cancer in America, and so the cancer side, we felt very strongly about. But at the same time, like, I was most excited, I think, when we first started talking about this project, about this being a story about women's health, and about us being able to really confidently, through really eloquent speakers like Rachel, like Deirdre Cooper Owens, like Leah Hazard, like the people that you just met in this clip, be able to talk about stuff on camera, and at the same time, to be able to write narration that you would actually hear, words like scraping cervical cells, that we would name the vagina, that we would talk about these areas that, going in, maybe you didn't think we'd be talking about on PBS and in a very sort of serious historical way, but to not be afraid to look away while at the same time being sensitive about, what story we're trying to tell, and how we're doing it. I think, what we hoped we achieved was really a film that was for everyone and that had a little bit of something for everyone, and also underlined, the story of this first war on cancer, but at the same time that didn't remove women so completely, and women's body parts, had to be quite central the whole time. So I think that was just a long introduction to whatever wonderful thing Rachel will say.
I love the way you put it, Gene. I think that you really marry the importance and the scope of why this work was important with the need to just use the real words and name the anatomy correctly. And I've spent a good amount of my career working on that. I wrote a book with the word vagina in the title, and it's beautiful to see how you weave that for an institution like PBS. And it's clear why it's necessary to not be euphemistic or use coded language, because we are talking about people's health, and these words aren't shameful, taboo, or unspeakable. If they are, that harms everyone's health.
And one of the things that we also thought was really important to tackle head on in this film, as you both said, it's using the proper words, like using the biological terms, using the vocabulary, and not being embarrassed or shy or falling into that same trap that so many medical professionals and biologists fell into. But one of the other things that we really thought was important to highlight was how race also comes into this story. And so in the clip, we saw the introduction of Dr. Helen Dickens, who is an incredible physician, surgeon, science activist, educator. What we didn't see in this clip was when you watch the full film, you'll see that we go more into her story and the difficulty that she faced in trying to spread the word within the African American community, and for very good reason. So, Deirdre, if I can bring you into the conversation, can you talk about the obstacles that Dr. Dickens faced, not just as a woman, not just as a Black woman, but now also a physician who is trying to share this innovation with a community that is very skeptical?
Yeah. Thank you for that. This is just a wonderful film, and we're highlighting names that are not that common. And so, as a historian, that brings me a lot of joy. With Dr. Dickens, I think what's really important, in fact, I was sharing this with a reproductive justice advocate today, and we were talking, and I said, she's doing reproductive justice work decades before the term is coined by a group of Black women in 1994. And the reason that she's doing this kind of work is because she is going out in the community by herself, going into housing projects, going to community centers, talking to Black people of every age, gender. And she is really, kind of an apostle for having them have a voice, advocate for themselves, and teaching them what she knows. And as someone who writes about enslaved people and people who lived in the 19th century, in very many ways, I think with her being the child of someone who was formerly enslaved, she's using the collective as her grounding, for how to gain trust from the community members. And you see that, it doesn't take a long time. You see all members of the community from, very elite all the way to people who are, on the ground, a little bit more salt of the earth, trust her. She builds alliances kind of everywhere she goes, and she sees the diversity of the Black community in urban Philadelphia. And she kind of, speaks to the expertise in each of those communities. And it really is something that can serve as a model, I think, for how we do organizing today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Deirdre and maybe Gene, you want to jump in as well. One of the things that we talk about in the film, and that when you watch the full film, you'll get to see the rest, and you'll get to see how we explore the issue I'm about to tee up. The roots of gynecology are, while critically important, very complicated, and there are some conflicts in there. Deirdre, in the film, you heartbreakingly tell the story of an enslaved woman, formerly enslaved woman, Anarcha, who is experimented on, and there's just this history of gynecology where doctors did not have the same kind of ethical or even moral guidelines that are the norm now. Can you talk about that a little bit more, so again we understand sort of the historical roots of the resistance in the African American community that Dr. Dickens was up against?
Right. Obstetrics and gynecology, become formalized in the 19th century, but the later part, I kind of deal with the messy points of origin in the antebellum era, and how, these branches of medicine certainly could have existed without the existence of American slavery. But US chattel slavery helps it to develop much quicker. And why is that? Because you can literally use the bodies of enslaved people without their consent, as long as you are promising the owner that you are going to repair these women's reproductive health. And you're doing that because the engine of slavery essentially rests upon the healthy births of enslaved children. So essentially, enslaved women when they're pregnant, they pass on a lifelong condition of bondage or lifelong servitude to their children. It's a law that is as old as British colonial slavery in the country that later becomes the United States. And so understanding that, it helps to paint a clearer picture of the landscape of medicine in this country in the 19th century. And so the ways that contemporary Americans think about ethics or even a moral compass, I often say, it didn't exist in the same way, because we're talking about a country that literally had people into two groups. You were either owned or you were free. Right. And so that's really the guiding principle. And medical experimentation just becomes part and parcel for the development of many branches of medicine in this country.
Gene, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was it's a question that I think underlined a lot of our investigations too, sort of throughout the film, and Professor Cooper Owens speaks about it so beautifully. I mean, I think we were really interested in, why were women studied, and why this interest, not just, as we're talking about here with the origins of gynecology, but again, and even in the 1910s and 1920s, and we did see this in the clip, I'm starting to talk about eugenics. The interest is not a benevolent one. You're talking about not necessarily benevolent. You're talking about being curious about women's bodies and their functions for, in some cases, pretty overtly utilitarian means, and more. So I think sort of throughout, not just the question of consent and the legacies of this story, but also, why were people looking in the first place? I mean, the guinea pigs have cute noses, but, why are we looking at them, and why are we looking at their uteri? I think all these questions come back to, why are they looking, and what can be done with that science? At the same time, what does come out of it? I think it's something that we really tried to grapple with in the film.
Mm-hmm. And Rachel, you've spent a lot of time thinking about and studying the involvement of women in their own, in the development of this field and in understanding the science. One of the things that we see with Mary Papanicolaou is that she is integral, as you said, to the development of this test. She's largely, until recently, erased from the history.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about the strange conflict of women being critical to the development of the science and the theory, but not being given their due and equal access to the resources and the education and the labs in order to be able to do this work?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely saw in Mary a pattern I've seen again and again. There are these generations of bench scientists, lab scientists, often called technicians, who are responsible or integral to some of the biggest discoveries, often in reproductive health, but elsewhere as well. For instance, a lab technician to Dr. John Rock, who was the first person to perform IVF. Her name's Miriam Menken. She is literally a footnote in history, as other scientists have called her. And I love both the contrast and juxtaposition of Mary and Dr. Dickens, because I mean, as we said, like, Mary is not only contributing vaginal smears every day, which, just imagine doing that for 20 years, but also analyzing them, serving as the scientist, owning the means of reproduction. But you actually don't get much of her voice. So there's almost a tendency now to kind of heroize some of these women who have been erased from science. And it's just like a pity, as a journalist, it's gold to have the voice that we have from Dr. Dickens. To hear her saying those quotes really brings her to life, as this documentary does for all of these characters. And it just makes me wish that we had that for Mary. And actually, speaking of the ecosystem in which science communication and discovery gets made, without Deirdre, I don't think I would have made this kind of connection. Her work on Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy helped me understand that you could view this history through a different lens, instead of merely looking at them as victims, but as actual surgical assistants. And it was Deirdre's work that uncovered that and helped me, I think, some of these women written out of history as more than bench scientists, more than devoted, loyal wives, more than typewriters. And with Mary, it's clear that that's the case. And you know, if you get your pap smear and you want to think of her instead of George, I think that's fine. You have my permission.
Well, there's it's just the last name, so I think you have got everybody's permission. Papa Nicolaus Smear could be either.
Indeed. And Rachel, you in so generously acknowledging Deirdre and her work that is so critical to understanding this field, you bring us back again, not just to the enslaved women who were just critical to this work, but you also make me think again of Dr. Sims, who I live in New York City, and I remember a couple of years ago there was a statue of Dr. James Marion Sims that was, I can't remember if it was in Central Park or it was some Manhattan park, and he was known as the father of gynecology. And a couple of years ago, that statue was taken down, and there was a rethinking of him and his work. I don't know if Deirdre, if there's anything that you want to add about Dr. Sims, which again, you talk about him very eloquently in the film. It came after the clip that we saw in the rest of the film, but if you could talk about him and his role a little bit.
Sure, I will offer this one funny story about the removal of his statue. I often share with my students and they get a hearty laugh. So April 17th, 2018, his statue is removed. My phone is ding, ding, dinging. And so I thought, gosh, I'd never received so much birthday love on this day. His statue was removed on my birthday. And so as a Sims continues to haunt me, I just can't seem to be in this space without kind of, Sims's ghost there. What I will say, I think, is much more important for me, if I'll pivot just a little bit, is to really talk about the legacy of Sims and his surgical team, the successful surgical team that helps him to come up with the surgical repair of, back then, vesicovaginal fistula. Today we call it obstetrical fistula, where essentially there's a hole or fistula because of the sloughing of the upper vaginal area after a very prolonged childbirthing session, and it creates incontinence. If there's a tear in the anus, there's also incontinence there. So Sims and this team of enslaved women, including Anarcha Betsy Lucy in Alabama in the 1840s, they come up with this reparative method. I think what is important, though, beyond the kind of stating of facts, is the legacy that we're talking about. And I think that's something that this documentary does really well. What is the legacy, right? I tend to do a lot of work with reproductive justice. The legacy is the kind of birthing crisis that we're in now. But if we can think about that, sometimes as opposed to whether a statue is removed or stays. And I don't want to diminish the importance of symbols, but for me, when journalists would ask that question, I would often pivot to, well, let's think about the legacy of Sims and what we're dealing with in this current moment. And so with the pap smear and cervical cancer, I think back to what is the legacy now, right? It's still devastating, as Gene mentioned earlier, right? There's not an American who hasn't been touched by cancer in some way. But when I think about the early 1930s and the mortality rate was 78%, right? Before we knew of the smear, before we had this the pap smear and this examination, for me, there at least was a centering of women's reproductive health and lives that continues. And so that's something that's really encouraging for me. When you write about slavery and experimentation, you often don't have a triumph at the end. But for me, this legacy is triumphant in many ways.
Very important point. Very important point. Speaking of other triumphs, Gene, I remember how exciting it was to see some of the footage of the Women's Field Army and to see some of the early philanthropists who wanted to channel funds into research into women's health and particularly into cancers that affected women. Can you talk about some of that early energy around research that went into slashing cervical cancer deaths?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the story of the Women's Field Army isn't one that I'd known before taking on this project. And, we were very lucky to get to talk to Kirsten Gardner, who wrote a beautiful book on these women. And I think that, it puts us back in this moment, like we're talking about, in this time where cancer was an even more terrifying disease. And yet, I think what surprised me right away was the openness and frankness with which, once this group gets going, women were talking about cancer and women were talking about, breast cancer and cervical cancer, using these words in the 30s and putting them on paper in some cases and speaking in particular, women to women at women's clubs and women's groups. And so I think when we started to peel back the layers on the early history of cancer, it was kind of both sides. One, it was a very foreign world because in some ways, it wasn't talked about in the same way. But on the other side, there was an openness that in some cases we don't even see today. And there were these spaces for women to talk to each other about their health and about, the signs of cancer and how to look for it. So I think that, that energy was and it was so important to us too to highlight. I mean, this was activism, grassroots activism, across the country that did make real differences pretty quickly. And then as we move through the 40s and the American Cancer Society sort of becomes transformed yet again, and this is in the rest of the film, you briefly meet this character of Mary Lasker, who's another force and who really is the fundraiser and an adept politician, and who really revolutionizes cancer research and the kind of federal funding and attention that it receives in this country. So I think on the one hand, the film is full of this real collection of heroes, but at the same time, you start to see that they all had to come together, and it does underline the precariousness of it all. Sorry, cameo. That all these forces do have to work in unison. And if one drops out, that you're really, you're not going to have access to, to this life-saving technology in the same way. So I think we were always looking at both sides as we were mapping out this history.
And Rachel, while we were watching the clip, I was watching you, there were a number of moments where I saw you nodding or smiling. Can you talk a little bit more about why it's so important to be having this conversation?
Yeah, like I said, I was so psyched to hear that PBS was interested in doing a documentary on the history of the pap smear that I think literally when I got the email from Gene that said pap smear and documentary, I was just like, I'm in. I don't need to know anything else. Which just like tells you, and I was also like, why doesn't this exist yet? Even though the answer is quite obvious. Yeah, I mean, I literally talking about my book online, the word vagina is often censored. I have posts taken down, and anyone who does reproductive justice work is dealing with this, that use words like vagina, cervix, clitoris, uterus. It is still a very difficult atmosphere to have a frank conversation about women's bodies. And this knowledge is really powerful. You can't talk about the pap smear without talking about cervix as the transformation zone where these cells appear, and also as a very important organ that's dynamic and doing a lot of work when it doesn't have cancer and isn't making a baby. I guess I talk a lot about the lens with which medicine has historically viewed women's bodies, and I talk about it as sort of a camera obscura, or like portrait mode on your iPhone. Basically, you're focusing on two things: fertility and disease. And the disease is often cancer. It's disease that can kill you. And in doing so, you're leaving out so much of what the female body is doing and how dynamic our entire reproductive systems are. And it struck me watching this film that you are still talking about disease and cancer, but it opens up a conversation to talk about women's quality of lives, about the structural forces that are preventing them from living full lives, especially Black women, and these undermining assumptions and biases that they don't have to worry about this. It opens up a broader conversation about, as Gene was talking about, woman to woman, like conversations about your health, your body, things that are crucial to talk about, but that are silenced often in everyday conversation. So I think this film really contributes to lifting that stigma and making explicit this intersection between engaging and fascinating and scientific and important, like critically important to everyone's health and everyone's lives. And I think it's a really powerful intersection.
Thank you for that. I just want to remind the audience that you can put questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer as many as we can during the time that we have left. One question from the audience: were Henrietta Lacks's cells a part of Dr. Papanicolaou's research and testing? Can anyone answer that? I think the time periods are off, but
I can speak to that actually. Yes, Henrietta Lacks had cervical cancer just before the pap smear. Correct me if I'm wrong, Deirdre. Just before the pap smear took off, even though it's not clear it would have been used on her at the time when she went to Johns Hopkins. But her cells, as I know it, were actually used by a different research lab to create immortal cells that could be studied for a variety of reasons. To me, the connection when I thought about those two things was that if the timing was different, but if there were people like Dr. Dickens making their efforts in the Black community to spread this word, efforts that like mainstream medicine was not making on its own, she very well could have had this caught early. She was not someone who was able to have early screening at all. The mass was already growing when it was found, but also doctors didn't offer her any treatment. So there's definitely a connection there.
And I think that, again, that's just, you bring up the importance of Dr. Dickens and other physicians like her who have the understanding that there is this whole other community that could use this information, can use this knowledge, can use these life-saving tools that had been denied in so many ways. In the film, Gene, we talk about how the skepticism in the African-American community stemmed from not just the experiences of enslaved women like Anarcha and Betsy and Lucy, who you referred to, Deirdre, in your work, but even experiments that happened decades after that, like the experiences of the Tuskegee Airmen and other Black men who were experimented on and intentionally infected with syphilis and other things just so that they could be studied. Gene, without going into too much detail, can you talk a little bit more about, again, just the environmental factors that made this work both so difficult and so important?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, one of the great privileges in having a chance to make this film was the opportunity to talk to Dr. Jane Henderson Brown about her mom and her mom's work. And, one of the things that really comes across, and, it comes across if you read Rachel's work on Dr. Dickens as well, is just, the absolute force that this doctor was, and just her stamina and her constant work. I mean, she worked all the time, and her daughter has this beautiful line in the film about how she was there for her patients, and she was there no matter what. And one of the ways that we talked a lot about why she had to work so hard and why she felt like she needed to be working out in the community as much as she was, given these legacies of both the legacies of slavery, legacies of scientific experimentation writ large, stories and realities about sterilization, and when we bring up the eugenics movement, these were American realities. And so I think one of the things that's really both beautiful and really tragic is that Philadelphia had Helen Dickens, and not every community did. And the women of Philadelphia, the Black women of Philadelphia, and Dr. Brown says this in the film. She says, I think her legacy is this gift that she gave to whoever came within 10 feet of her. And it's true. But 10 feet, it covers most of Philadelphia, and she's still remembered there. But it doesn't cover the entire United States. So I think, relying on single people to change the course of women's health is a very dangerous thing. And in some cases, it does. It changes history. But we need more. We need more support. We need to make sure we're reaching everyone all the time.
Deirdre, before the screening started, we were talking about how there are so many women, particularly African American women, African American female physicians, who are also a part of Dr. Dickens' legacy, not just her daughter, who is a physician as well, but so many others. Can you share something about that?
Oh, sure. And in fact, I mean, this is just how short history is, and how small the world. One of my mentors, Dr. Vanessa Northington Gamble, who's an MD, PhD, and she saw the trailer in her very large personality way. She sends me a message, and she's like, "Oh, so I see you're going to be on this, this documentary. That Dr. Dickens was my mentor when I was at Penn." Right. And I'm just kind of like, my goodness, the world is so small. But also, by the time Dr. Dickens is mentoring my mentor, Dr. Northington Gamble, there's a creation of institutes, and also programs where people have created structures now, so that the burden isn't placed on the shoulders of just one person. And I think that's important. And also, for communities, whether they're rural, whether they're Black, whether they're poor, but sometimes communities that are stereotypically seen as being anti-science, I think this shows with the immigrant community. I think this shows with the Black community, with people who might not have some of the formal education, that there is an embrace of science. And that's really important for me, when I teach history of medicine classes and medical humanities courses, that people in the community were the foot soldiers for educating the masses about the efficacy of science. And medical science. And I think that that's also something that's important, that Dr. Dickens' legacy, has extended for all of us.
I might add, I love that. I might add that it's not just that these communities aren't anti-science. I keep thinking that it's no coincidence that each of these four characters kind of stand a little bit outside the American dream, either because they are immigrants, they are Japanese-born Americans experiencing racism, they are a Black woman physician, and you need new voices to come to the table and ask new questions in science. And I think that, again, these were all sort of exceptions to the rule of their time. They overcome a lot of structural forces, but they were asking questions, or they had a stake in this question of cervical cancer that other people didn't. And so it's not just that they had the capacity to be in science and medicine doing this work, but that actually they're vitally needed in science and medicine, because we need those perspectives, and we need them structurally, not just in the case of the one exception who leaves a powerful and long legacy.
Yeah. And if I can add too, I think that this is wonderful in terms of the kind of tapestry of American history. Often when I say I'm a historian, people think, who's the first person who did this or the first person who did that, right? And I'm like, that's trivia. You might win on a game show, right? But American history is really about what this documentary captures, and that I'm really happy to be a part of, because it's showing that medicine and science can teach us about really critical moments in American history. And also that, just like a quilt, right? We are looking at people who are so different from each other in terms of their experiences, and yet they have this common goal to eradicate cancer, right? That is a scourge on the society, even in the midst of deep oppression, right? They're still dedicated to it. I am amazed, at the excerpt that we all saw tonight of Murayama and his wife, essentially being in a center, a relocation center, essentially like an internment. And yet he comes out because he wants to save, as he wrote, American women's lives, right? It just blows me away. So thank
For
you
sure.
both, doing this film.
We are so proud. We are so proud. Thank you. Gene, can you talk a little bit more about Hashime Murayama? He, as Deirdre just said, as Rachel said, this story it's about Dr. George Papanicolaou. It's about Mary. It's about Dr. Helen Dickens. But Hashime Murayama is also just a critical piece of this equation. And we were thrilled to learn more about him and how he fit into this puzzle as well. Can you just share a little bit more about his role?
Absolutely. And I think, Rachel, you put it so eloquently. I think this idea of standing just outside the American dream is such a powerful one. And I think it's true. And Hashime Murayama's work, we were thrilled to discover. I mean, I think, we were able to work with a journalist, Sam Keane, who'd written about Murayama a little bit, and who'd started to sort of put together pieces of this history. But we were also able to actually get into the documents and look at his internment file. I think really for the first time, a lot of these things, so we're able to do real pioneering history, that ends up being sort of the basis for our understanding of his internment. And we were also able to be in touch with his granddaughter, which was I think it's always really exciting to us as filmmakers to be able to talk to family members, but at the same time, it does bring something really different. I think it reminds us to pay attention to the fact that these were people, they're not just characters in a story. And we were able to share with her, some of these documents that we were finding about her grandfather's experience was really important to us as well. And Murayama and his artwork, I'm still blown away by. I watch these sequences. I've seen them maybe 150,000 times, and they're still beautiful. And the cancer cells are beautiful, which is something we grappled with a little bit. We're looking at these drawings of a deadly disease, and he's made them both legible for other scientists and other practitioners to be able to interpret the results. But he's also created, undeniable works of art. And so I think for us, his story, yeah, it's more surprising than a Hollywood film, but at the same time, like, I think there was such a clear humanity there and such a seriousness with which he approached everything he did, and he's constantly pioneering the way that he does these drawings, inventing and patenting, and we talk about this a little bit in the film, inventing and patenting devices that are going to allow him to draw things more true to life. And I think it's always been one of our favorite moments. And, Rachel, you take the baton in the film and you say it, but that science communicators are really at the heart of this as well. And that if you're going to teach the world how to read millions and billions of pap smears, you're going to have to do it visually. And to bring to have the opportunity to bring this man's work back into the public eye. And I will say, for people watching, I mean, you don't just have to appreciate his cancer drawings. He has this massive body of work that I think is really due for re-examination, and this really beautiful work that he did at Nat Geo. So all kinds of wildlife, not just from animals that interest my family, like spiders and bees, but really all kinds of fish and fowl. So I think he's worth another look, on all those grounds.
I loved learning about him in the film. He was actually not so much on my radar, but it was so striking to me that he clearly had such a wonder and awe for the natural world. He would spend hours in aquariums, and like you said, that's so clear in the rest of his body of work, but that he kind of brought that wonder and awe to the female body, even to cervical cancer cells. And I'm biased, but I personally think that's a superpower that scientific communicators can bring. I think we were speaking earlier before this panel about the role of shame in women's health and the role it plays in preventing progress and preventing people from getting the care they need. One way I've found of combating some of that shame is through wonder and awe, and kind of disarming someone by looking at the familiar in a new way, in a way that makes them ask new questions and even say, I didn't know this could be beautiful. Just as outer space fills us with awe and wonder at being so small, I think inner space can do something similar when in the right hands of someone like Mariama. And there's the importance of knowledge transfer. He was distilling kind of the types of cells that he wanted other cytologists to be able to identify, but you also have to create such a compelling image that it's memorable and striking immediately. And his pictures of cancer cells look like the pictures of sea creatures, like they're unforgettable.
Thank you. I appreciate that point, and I think that we can all agree that science communication is critical for all of us to understanding our bodies, understanding our worlds, and it is certainly the foundation of what we're doing here. So I just want to thank our panelists. We are out of time. Thank you to Gene Tempest, who is the writer and director of this film. Thank you to Deirdre Cooper Owens for sharing so much insight and analysis in this film. Thank you to Rachel Gross for also just sharing so much insight and not being afraid to use the words, right? And to really approach this with the rigor and the seriousness that it deserves. So again, thank you to all of you for joining us tonight. I hope that you will watch the full film when it airs next Tuesday on March 26th on PBS stations nationwide, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central. Again, thank you for joining us for this preview and discussion of The Cancer Detectives on PBS. Good night.
Thank you.